For over a millennium, the area we now know as Liverpool was a non-entity. The Romans, those master mappers of the British Isles, didn't bother to build a fort there. The Vikings, who pillaged and settled almost every viable coastline in the north, bypassed its muddy banks. When the Doomsday Book was compiled in 1086, a comprehensive census of every pig, plough, and peasant in England, Liverpool wasn't even mentioned. It was a blank space on the map, a tidal inlet characterized by stagnant water and biting winds. By 1571, nearly 4 centuries after its official founding, it was dismissed in royal records as Her Majesty's poor, decayed town, home to a measly 600 souls struggling against the elements. This is the paradox of insignificance. There was no natural momentum here, no ancient lineage of power, and no abundance of resources. Yet this very lack of promise is what makes its eventual rise so chilling. How does a town too small to matter, a place that lived in the shadow of Chester and London for centuries, suddenly vault itself into the center of the world's most horrific economic engine? The answer isn't found in natural beauty or divine favor. It is found in a cold, calculated desperation. Liverpool did not grow organically, it was engineered. It was a city born of politics and saved by a business model that treated human life as a replaceable commodity. This is not just the story of a port. It is the story of how a poor, decayed town became the beating heart of a global crime against humanity. To understand Liverpool, you have to understand King John, a monarch known more for his failures than his triumphs. In 1207, John needed a new port in the northwest. He wasn't looking for a center of trade. He was looking for a military staging ground to launch invasions into Ireland. Chester, the established regional power, was under the control of a powerful earl whom John didn't trust. So with the stroke of a quill, he carved Liverpool out of a tidal swamp. He offered land incentives and burgage plots to anyone willing to move to this uninviting mire. It was a town created for the sake of strategic spite. For the next 400 years, Liverpool existed in a state of suspended animation. It was a town of 7 streets, a modest market, and a small castle that watched over a population that refused to grow. While the rest of England was beginning to feel the tremors of the early modern world, Liverpool was a stagnant backwater. People lived and died in the same mud their ancestors had trod, with no inkling that they were sitting on the edge of a future Atlantic explosion. There was no momentum, only a stubborn, gritty persistence. They survived the Black Death, they survived civil wars, but they remained marginal. It was this very marginalization, this hunger for a purpose, that made the city so receptive to the dark opportunity that arrived at the dawn of the 18th century. The year 1699 is the most pivotal date in the history of the Mersey. It began quietly, without fanfare, when a single ship called the Liverpool Merchant cleared the harbor. It didn't carry traditional goods. It was a pioneer of a new, brutal economic logic. When that ship returned, having successfully traded manufactured goods for human beings in Africa and selling them into slavery in the Americas, the financial return was so staggering that it sent a shockwave through the town's merchant class. This wasn't just a successful voyage, it was a proof of concept. The Liverpool Merchant proved that human trafficking was the ultimate, get-rich-quick scheme for a town with nothing to lose. This single voyage triggered a psychological shift in the populace. What was once a peripheral activity became the town's central nervous system. The merchants of Liverpool looked at the Atlantic and didn't see a barrier. They saw a conveyor belt. This wasn't a gradual descent into immorality. It was an overnight adoption of a business model that worked with terrifying efficiency. The poor, decayed town had finally found its calling, and it was a calling written in blood and balance sheets. If the slave trade was the fuel, then Liverpool's infrastructure was the engine. In 1715, the city took a gamble that would change maritime history forever. They built the Thomas Steers Dock, the world's first commercial wet dock. Before this, ships were at the mercy of the massive 30-foot tides of the River Mersey. They had to wait for hours or days to unload, losing time and money. The wet dock used a system of gates to keep water in even when the tide went out, allowing ships to stay afloat and operational 24/7. This was logistical brilliance used for an evil end. This massive public investment in infrastructure turned Liverpool into the fastest, most flexible port in the British Empire. It allowed for a high-volume, high-turnover system perfectly suited for the cargo they were carrying. While ships in London or Bristol were stuck in the mud waiting for the tide, Liverpool's fleet was already halfway to the coast of Africa. The city didn't just participate in the slave trade, it optimized it. They built warehouses that could store thousands of tons of sugar and cotton, and they developed specialized smithies that produced the very shackles used on the Middle Passage. The city's physical growth was a direct reflection of its capacity to process human suffering. History often asks why Liverpool surpassed the established giants of London and Bristol. The answer lies in a perfect storm of three distinct advantages. First, geography. During Britain's frequent wars with France and Spain, the English Channel was a graveyard for merchant ships. Liverpool, tucked away on the northwest coast, offered a safer route around the north of Ireland, bypassing the privateers. Second, the Isle of Man. This nearby island acted as a massive tax-free loophole. Liverpool merchants could store African goods, alcohol, gunpowder, and textiles on the island without paying duties, then ship them out at a fraction of the cost their competitors faced. The third, and perhaps most vital force, was the proximity to the burgeoning industrial revolution in Lancashire. Liverpool was the natural outlet for the Manchester textile mills. These mills produced the cheap cotton goods that were prized by African leaders in exchange for captives. This created a closed-loop system. The ships left Liverpool with Manchester cloth, traded it for people in Africa, traded the people for raw cotton in the Caribbean, and brought that cotton back to Liverpool to feed the Manchester mills. It was a triangular trade of unmatched speed and volume. Liverpool didn't just dominate the trade, it became the trade's indispensable hub. By the mid-1700s, Liverpool had become a gleaming jewel of the Enlightenment on the surface. Visitors described a city of modern wonders, docks crowded with forest-like masts, warehouses bursting with exotic spices, and grand civic buildings like the Town Hall and the Bluecoat Hospital. Merchants in powdered wigs walked the streets, discussing philosophy and art. But beneath this veneer of progress lay a dark reality. In the very same shipyards that built the elegant vessels for the elite, workers were fitting out lower decks with shelves only 18 inches high. They were forging chains and branding irons. The prosperity of the city was a mask. Every grand Georgian townhouse, every paved street, and every charitable donation to the local infirmary was paid for by the black gold of the Atlantic. Progress and brutality were not just neighbors, they were the same thing. The city's identity was fractured, a place that looked like a testament to human achievement, but was actually a monument to human exploitation. Liverpool's true innovation was the systemic normalization of the slave trade. They turned a chaotic, risky venture into a predictable, industrialized process. They pioneered the fractional ownership of slave ships, allowing small investors, butchers, bakers, and even widows to buy a share in a voyage. This spread the risk and ensured that the entire community was financially invested in the success of the trade. If a ship was lost, no one was ruined. If it succeeded, everyone profited. This financial normalization led to a chilling disregard for life. On these voyages, death was not a tragedy, it was a line item in a ledger. Ship surgeons kept meticulous logs of mortality rates, not to save lives, but to calculate the attrition rate for future insurance claims. The slave trade in Liverpool wasn't just a business, it was a science. They calculated exactly how much water a captive needed to survive just long enough to be sold. They optimized the packing of the hold to maximize profit per square inch. It was a level of cold-blooded optimization that the world had never seen before. To grasp the magnitude of Liverpool's role, one must look at the numbers, though they are almost too large to comprehend. Between 1699 and the abolition of the trade in 1807, Liverpool was responsible for over 5,000 individual slave voyages. These ships transporting an estimated 1.5 million African men, women, and children across the Atlantic. This is more than any other port in human history. By the final decades of the 18th century, Liverpool wasn't just a participant, it was the monopoly. It accounted for over 80% of Britain's slave trade and nearly half of the entire European trade. The city had effectively swallowed the competition. If you saw a slave ship in the Atlantic in 1790, 4 times out of 5, it had come from the Mersey. Liverpool had become the system itself, a giant, unblinking machine that processed human lives into British sterling. The wealth generated by this trade didn't just vanish. It became the literal stone and mortar of the city. The merchant elites who grew rich on the trade, names like Tarleton, Leyland, and Gladstone, didn't just keep their money. They became the mayors, the MPs, and the civic leaders of Liverpool. They named the streets after themselves and their colleagues. Even today, as you walk through Liverpool, you are walking through a map of the slave trade.
Get off the gangway, quickly now.
Please, sir, we're looking for
Street names like Penny Lane, possibly named after James Penny, Bold Street, and Cunliffe Street, are echoes of men who built their fortunes on the Middle Passage. The grand institutions of the city, from the prestigious schools to the Athenaeum Library, were funded by the profits of the trade. The city's physical and political landscape was shaped by slavery, embedding it permanently into the urban DNA. It is a city where the architecture itself is a witness to a crime that was never fully reconciled.
The proposed amendment will undermine the very foundation.
We must never forget the reality of the Middle Passage that funded this golden age. For the captives, it was an experience of concentrated horror. They were stripped of their names, their clothes, and their humanity. They were packed into dark, suffocating holds where the air was so thick with the smell of blood, excrement, and sweat that a candle would not burn. Disease, dysentery, and smallpox ravaged the ships.
We will not yield our trade.
The mortality rate was staggering, often reaching 15% to 20% per voyage. But even for those who survived the crossing, the ordeal was far from over. Nearly half of those who arrived in the Americas died within their first year due to the brutal labor and the shock of new diseases. This suffering was not hidden from the merchants in Liverpool. It was reported in the newspapers and discussed in the coffee houses. They knew. They simply decided that the profit was worth the pain. This is the hardest truth to confront. That an entire city of people could look at such suffering and choose to look the other way for the sake of a balanced ledger. As the 1800s dawned, Liverpool was a city of extreme contrasts. On one hand, you had the grand Georgian squares inhabited by the merchant princes. On the other, you had some of the most horrific slums in Europe. The explosive population growth, fueled by the wealth of the trade, had created a desperate underclass. And soon, a new group of victims would arrive at the same docks that had seen the slave ships depart. During the Irish potato famine, hundreds of thousands of starving refugees poured into Liverpool. They were packed into cellar dwellings with no light or ventilation, facing many of the same conditions, disease, starvation, and mass death that the enslaved Africans had faced. The city that had built its wealth on the exploitation of one group of people was now witnessing the slow death of another. The docks remained the center of the city, but the faces of the suffering had changed. It was a cycle of misery that seemed baked into the very soil of the port.
Tells the horrific reality of the Middle Passage.
When the British slave trade was finally abolished in 1807, it wasn't because of a change of heart in Liverpool. In fact, Liverpool's merchants fought abolition tooth and nail, sending petitions to Parliament claiming that the city's economy would collapse without the trade. Abolition was forced upon them by moral pressure from the rest of the country and a shifting economic landscape. But even after 1807, Liverpool did not truly walk away from slavery. The city simply pivoted. Instead of transporting people, they transporting the products of enslaved labor, cotton and sugar. The networks remained intact. The wealth stayed in the banks. The grand buildings still stood. Liverpool continued to profit from the system of slavery until the American Civil War finally brought the plantation economy to its knees. The city's innocence was a legal fiction. Its economic reality remained tied to the shackle and the whip for decades after the ships stopped sailing to Africa.
As the wealth flows globally, we must ask,
In 2007, 200 years after the abolition of the trade, Liverpool formally apologized for its role in the slave trade and opened the International Slavery Museum. It was a moment of profound reflection, yet the contradiction remains unresolved. The city is a place of incredible culture, music, and resilience, the home of the Beatles, 2 world-class soccer teams, and a spirit of defiance. But it is also a city built on a crime. As you look at the stunning waterfront today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, until its recent removal, you see a place of beauty and innovation. But if you look closer, you see the names on the walls. You see the echoes of the poor, decayed town that decided to become great by becoming cruel. To understand Liverpool is to confront this duality, that human beings are capable of both immense creativity and unimaginable heartlessness. What can we learn from the dark rise of Liverpool? The most important lesson is that efficiency is not the same as morality. Liverpool became the most efficient port in the world, but it used that efficiency to perfect a system of human trafficking. In our daily lives, we are often obsessed with optimization, productivity, and success. We are told to find what works and do it at scale. But Liverpool teaches us to ask a more important question: at what cost? If our success is built on the exclusion, exploitation, or suffering of others, is it truly success? We must learn to look beneath the surface of our own lives and our own systems. We must be brave enough to challenge the business models that promise us wealth at the expense of our humanity. History is not just something that happened, it is something that is still happening within us. I want to hear from you. How do you think modern cities should handle the names and monuments of those who built wealth through exploitation? Do you see parallels between the industrialized slave trade of the 18th century and any modern economic systems today? How can we honor the victims of history while still celebrating the resilience and culture of the cities they helped build? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's engage in a dialogue that is as deep and nuanced as history itself. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel to help us keep these stories alive. Until next time.